August 18th marks the 100th anniversary of ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granting women the right to vote. ACHP Chairman Aimee Jorjani recently spoke with Andrea DeKoter, superintendent of the Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls, New York, where in 1848, a women's rights convention was held, officially kicking off the women's rights movement. That convention pointed out many areas where women's rights were limited, but one right, the right to vote, stood out as a key to reaching those other rights. Superintendent DeKoter noted that historic buildings such as those preserved at the park helped to tell the story of the women's suffrage movement. Now here's Chairman Jorjani and Andrea DeKoter.
Today we are doing a little celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. With us today is the superintendent for the Women's Rights National Historic Park up in Seneca Falls, New York. Superintendent Andrea DeKoter, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I was looking at the website a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Women's Rights National Historic Park? In addition to what I found was interesting, the context of the time frame during this effort leading to the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, so Women's Rights National Historical Park commemorates the meeting of the first Women's Rights Convention, which was held in Seneca Falls, New York on July 19 and 20 of 1848. 5 women organized the convention in less than 2 days, and we have 3 of the organizers' homes that are part of the park as well. So essentially there's the Wesleyan Chapel that's part of the park, that's where the convention itself was held, and then 3 of the organizers' homes that people can drive up to and visit. And, you know, it's a really powerful story. You talk about the 19th Amendment and putting this in perspective, and it's a great way to phrase that because it was a 72-year struggle from 1848 until 1920 for women to get the right to vote in America. So a very long time in coming.
Mm-hmm. So Seneca Falls, being the launching point for this effort. So these buildings probably date back then quite some time. Can you tell me about the preservation of the buildings at the historic park?
Yeah, so the preservation story is a really interesting one. The Wesleyan Chapel, when the Park Service acquired it, it was thanks to the efforts, remarkably, of a group of women and some men in the 1970s who sat out on the corner by it was then a laundromat, if you can believe it, the irony of that. But the Wesleyan Chapel over time just continued to morph. It was a building in downtown Seneca Falls that at one point served as a roller skating rink. It was a movie theater, a car dealership. It played all these different roles in downtown Seneca Falls after the Wesleyan Methodists sold the church. And so you get to the 1970s and a group of women set up a card table at the corner by this laundromat, and they had people sign a petition to make this part of a national park site. And so it became a national park in 1980. And then a design competition was held to determine what would happen with the building because it was a laundromat and a lot of the original historic fabric had been lost. So ultimately, 2 young women won the design competition with this very remarkable design that was essentially the 2 standing walls that still remained of the chapel, along with some new fabric to shore it all up. And then the roof, underneath the roof was largely original. So you still have some of the girder beams in the roof that were original to the structure. And it was left as an open air structure. Over time, though, what we saw was that unfortunately, as you can imagine, the weather here is ever changing. And so that had a major impact on the chapel. And so in the early 2000s, a determination was made after much careful research that the building needed to be enclosed. And so 2 additional walls were added to the chapel to enclose everything, and there's a heating and cooling system, a very basic one in place, just to protect that historic brick fabric. And so now when you go to the chapel, it really is an enclosed space that shows us roughly what the original church would have looked like. But it's a really remarkable testimony to the ever-changing nature of preservation also. And then we also have the 3 homes that I mentioned. One of those was the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, arguably one of the most famous suffragists of the 19th century, one of the pioneer suffragists who championed women's rights to vote. And she, her home in Seneca Falls, again, was sold in 1862, and over time it changed quite a bit. It used to be much larger. There are 2 wings of the house that are no longer on the house. So it shrank over time. And I think that's one of the stories that a lot of people find remarkable when they come here, is just how much buildings can change. We think about historic preservation, and it's nice to think about everything being left intact, like the previous owners walked out the door, but quite often that's not the case. So this history had to be uncovered and preserved, which is really true of a lot of women's stories, as we know.
Mhm. How do the preserved buildings help tell the story of women's suffrage in the United States?
I think when people see the buildings themselves, they realize, wow, these are people like me. These were not extraordinarily wealthy people. They were well connected, and they were upper middle class white women. So I don't want to take away from that. There was privilege there.
Mm-hmm.
But in other respects, it's ordinary citizens. These were people who lived in other ways very unremarkable lives. And I think for people to see that and to think about what that meant, that they didn't have a washing machine, a dryer, a dishwasher. Quite often they did have household help for middle-class white women. That was more customary, but they were still up against a lot of these restrictive norms that held women back. And you think about Elizabeth Cady Stanton living in, not a palatial house, having 7 children. She loved her kids. She had them by choice, but she had 7 children, and she still managed to accomplish what she did. I think it's inspiring to people to consider that, right? I think when I look at that, wow, I complain about my load of laundry that I have to do, or I have to get my one daughter to school. But you look at what our foremothers were up against, and I think it makes you realize you can do it. We are super women. We can do all these things, and we can look at our foremothers for inspiration. So I think for a lot of people, they see that and they're inspired, and they also take away the message. It only takes a few people. It just takes a few people to affect that kind of incredible societal change. So there are a lot of powerful stories that can be told in those houses.
Yeah, I love the phrase foremothers. So wonderful. What are you doing to commemorate the 100th anniversary in this, well, I guess, unusual time and virtually?
Yes, it's been a very unusual year. 2020 is not exactly the way we anticipated. I think everybody has thrown out their planner at this point.
Yeah.
So we are commemorating the year virtually. We've had to pivot to a virtual format for our special events. Mm-hmm. So back in July, we offered a virtual Convention Days commemorative ceremony. And that's actually available online if you visit our website at nps.gov and then /WORI, short for Women's Rights. You can actually still find many of the programs that were offered as part of that virtual ceremony. So what we really strive to do was to commemorate 1848 and to help set the stage for 1920 this year, to really help people think about just the longevity of that struggle and why it went on as long as it did.
I noticed on the website that the historic site, what took place there was this Declaration of Sentiments. Can you tell me more about that convention?
Yeah, so the Declaration of Sentiments was the document that was produced for the first Women's Rights Convention. It was written by 3 of the organizers just a few days before they gathered on July 19 and 20. And they modeled it very deliberately on the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we know the Declaration of Independence states all men are created equal. Well, the women changed it in 1848 to note that all men and women are created equal, which not earth-shattering to us today, but in 1848, that was a revelation to be able to say that out loud. And then they listed their sentiments, which has nothing to do with being sentimental. Those are grievances or complaints that they identified in the Declaration. So one of those was the fact that women were denied the right of enfranchisement, the right to vote. But that's only one of the sentiments. The others address things like the lack of access to a higher education, since women were prohibited from going to colleges, to most colleges in 1848. They were also treated differently in terms of their right to be able to work outside the home. If they could find a job outside the home, it was going to be very menial, low-paid work. And so the list went on. And it was a very profound document that was a very holistic look at how women were treated in mid-19th century America. The right to suffrage becomes the most famous issue that comes out of that, and it becomes the focal point for the emergent women's rights movement, because that was seen as the key to gaining all these other rights, that if you could start to change the laws, women would be able to self-determine. They would be able to change those laws and then have the kinds of equal rights that they deserved.
So it went beyond the women's vote.
It did, yeah. It was really looking at it was taking a holistic approach. Suffrage ultimately became the championed cause of many of these women's rights activists, but others branched out into labor, they branched out into many other aspects of women's lives. Suffrage was seen as the key to obtaining many of those other rights. And that's why it becomes such a focal point for the movement, because women believed, well, if we achieve suffrage, we can change these laws. We can start to change all these different ways in which we're not receiving equal treatment.
Right. What can people do to learn more about the park? Is there any type of network with other suffrage-related sites in the country?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. We've been working closely with Belmont Paul and with a number of other sites. In fact, coming up, of course, is Women's Equality Day. And to honor that, we are offering programs for a weekend called Equality Weekend. That's going to be August 22 and 23, and it will be done entirely virtually. And we're going to, as the keynote point for that program, we're going to have a talk offered by Colleen Jenkins, who's the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Liza Mickens, who's the great-great-granddaughter of Maggie Lena Walker, a Black suffragist from Virginia, who has a National Historic Site in Richmond, Virginia, and then Kenneth Morris Jr. He is the great-great-grandson of both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. So we've been connecting with all those national park sites, and we really want people to reflect on the fact that 1920 was such a watershed year, but it didn't make the outcome equal for all women. Black women, Asian American women, women of color generally did not suddenly get the right to vote in 1920. There were many women still prevented from voting that year. So we want to reflect on that, to sort of celebrate the milestone, but reflect on what it didn't do. And we also want to remind people that you can find this history in so many places. You can go to the Booker T. Washington site. You can go to all these various places and learn about women's history and learn about the suffrage movement. So we're very excited to be partnering with so many parks.
Oh, that's great. Any other way people can enjoy virtually the buildings at your site or elsewhere?
Yeah, we're actually working right now on some tours of the buildings using 3D imagery that was printed for us.
Wow.
So yeah, we have a lot of digital landscaping that was done, thankfully, over the past couple of years. So we're putting that all together, and our Friends group has been helping with that as well. So we're looking forward to having that up online very soon. Andrea,
thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing information about your site and the network you've created celebrating this 100th year of the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Amy. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.